world, welcome to one more episode for Update Brazil. I'm here with Jeff Nyquist in Diana West. Good morning, Jeff.
Good morning, Alan.
Good
morning, Diana.
Jeff.
Okay. We were going to talk about the enemies of Western civilization, or the enemies of our countries. And I've been reading Carl Schmitt's book, The Concept of the Political, and it's very interesting. He says that political ideas are organized around the idea of who your enemy is and who your friend is. And I was thinking about the two principal enemies that we're fighting is Islam and of course communism or socialism or whatever you want to call it, something dark that's moving through Western civilization. And Diane, I was wondering if you could comment on this idea of enemies and how it works or doesn't.
Well, it doesn't work now, I would say, primarily because we're at the end of a very long chain of conditioning and education and coercion, really, to believe that there is no such thing as an enemy, and that there is no such thing as an enemy ideology, that we can all get along, that we're all really the same, we all want the same things. These are trends certainly pushed by our politicians all the time, and our media all the time. But I think at the base of them is the notion that just as we may not have friends and enemies, we've also gotten rid of lodestars of good and evil, black and white, any sort of notion that there are objective things to understand about oneself and one's survival and the rest of the world. There is no rest of the world anymore, so there can't be any enemy. And that mushes us right into the notions of globalism and one world, which again you see movement and coercion and propaganda coming from elites wherever, whatever country they're in, whatever Western country they're in, either in our hemisphere or in Europe, we're hearing this same notion. So that would be my general response to begin with.
And of course, we don't defend our borders anymore, because why not let all the nice people in?
This is part of the same movement to eliminate borders, to eliminate definition, nation states, to eliminate sovereignty, identity. These are all dangerous vectors. Oh, my phone, excuse me. These are all dangerous vectors of the same basic assaults on the West. And you can look at it in the micro fashion in one's own personal life, and you can see the concentric circles folding or pressing outward, whether it's the family unit that no longer is defined, marriage is no longer defined, the self is no longer defined. And then we see this going in greater and greater forms out to the nation state. You have outliers. We see them popping up. They're not supposed to, whether we're looking at Hungary's Viktor Orban, whether we look at discussions in this country coming out of people like Donald Trump. We do see almost atavistic expressions of these declarations of identity, of sovereignty, but they are bucking the trend, and they are generally excoriated in the public square. So I think it is all related, all of these same trends, and I think it's also a point to make that the enemies that we can identify of Western-style liberty come from the same kinds of collectivist movements, whether it's Islamic or communistic. These are both collectivist creeds that depend on outward expansion, outward aggression and conquest. These are what drive them, what give them energy. And if you look at the West, what we're looking at is the development of the enshrinement of individual conscience and liberty and freedom of worship, religion rather, freedom of speech. These are things that are at odds with collectivism, whether it's religious collectivism in Islam or atheistic collectivism in communism.
It's fascinating. What you said about the destruction of identity is fascinating, because when you're in a battle, you have a uniform and you have a flag.
Yes.
And it's sort of like they've taken away our flag, our uniform. They've taken away those things that mark us out as being a side,
Yes.
one side that you take in a battle, as if we don't have a side. You know,
Right.
we're supposed to be for everybody. I remember I was a bit disturbed by this commercial. Diana, you might have seen it, where you say, I am American, I am an American, and it's all different faces and races and people from all around the world saying, I'm an American. And I stopped and thought for a minute, but wait a minute, if everyone is American, then no one is an American.
Right. Right.
You
This
know?
is part of the same the same thing. I saw it in my daughter's schooling in grade school. The annual summer games that they would have at the end of the school year, three-legged races, that kind of thing. The teams were specifically different countries of the world. And these were for very little kids, and I found it part and parcel with what they were learning in the schools, a public school in New York State at the time, with this notion of not building a national identity, but again, building this world identity. It starts very young, and it's very effective. But again, I do think it is designed to subvert any kind of inward feelings of belonging to a group, a nation, a culture, a religion, and indeed it becomes, they use all kinds of terrible words to undermine any sort of allegiance you might feel. This is exclusive, you're drawing lines, you're not free and open. I mean, these are the choices we're given now to be. The good guys are free, open, always changing, evolving, and the retrograde people are those who draw lines and define themselves and have borders and identities. And this is really a very nefarious kind of form of conditioning, but it's really what we've all been growing with for at least half a century. I mean, more, but this is a big push, and it's definitely bearing fruit when you actually see physical assaults on sovereignty underway at our borders, whether it's the American southern border in particular, or certainly just vividly expressed and manifested in Europe right at this moment with the incursions coming in from the east. And
that relates directly to your comment about collectivism, because if you destroy the individual identity or the nation identity, then you can create a new collectivistic identity, and that seems to be the project, doesn't it?
It is. It does seem to be the project. These are things I started for myself working out when I wrote The Death of the Grown-Up. 8 years ago it came out, and unfortunately it remains very current. These sorts of problems have not gone away or even been addressed. Going back to the notion of identity, I have a chapter I think called Identity. Boundaries is another chapter. These were things that I was looking at the attrition of in the American personality. But of course this was a metaphor. The Death of the Grown-Up is just a metaphor to try to understand this disappearance of identity, of definition. And if you go back to the propaganda of the 1960s in particular, this idea that you never became anything was very strong in the schools at the time, very much part of the cutting edge of the whole 1960s revolution. This notion that you never grew up and became something, but rather that you were constantly changing, constantly open. This was the new virtue. And this we see now writ large in the failure of many people, not normal people, but certainly elites, certainly people who end up in positions of power, it seems, this failure to ever identify with their own peoples. Rather, they identify with other elites. And this is where you see the project really coalescing. And for me, when I look at what's going on in Europe, I see a revolution. It's a revolution of the elites against their own populations. And it seems to me to be almost something, I'm trying to think of precedent for it. I can't, yet at least in these terms. The elites of these countries are overthrowing their native populations for something new, for something that they are designing, this whole diversity project, forced diversity we might call it. And this seems to be the natural next stage of these many decades of conditioning to strip away our own senses of identity and to literally take away boundaries, not only of behavior, but now of our countries.
Interesting. Alan? Yeah.
Yes. I'm trying to remember the quotation from Marx that he says that the communism, the idea of socialism, it's something that you cannot define, but you kind of reveal every time. I quoted it a few weeks ago, but it was in Portuguese. Now I'm thinking English, so I can't go back to Portuguese and come back to English. But he said something like this. And there are three things I would like to add here. Andreas Hofer was a Christian guy that was fighting against Bonaparte, Napoleon Bonaparte in French, and he beat his army 3 times, and then Napoleon needed to kill him by himself. And that guy, he had three principles to fight. That's why he joined all his people in his village. He was defending the church at the time. He was Catholic, and with the figure of the Pope, he was defending the throne, and he was defending the nation. So the identity here, it's pretty clear that he defended something that was created by Christianism and was developing like a nation. So the idea of nation that we have, that comes from our Christian roots, and I do believe one of the most dangerous attack that we have nowadays, I was discussing with Jeff before we start, is going against the Christian religions, going against the Catholic Church, going against the Protestant Church, all kinds of Christian churches, and taking their leaders over, because those leaders, they used to guide all the nation, even they were not, how can I say, not in big numbers, but they used to be very influenced, and taking over the leaders of Christianism in the world was the most dangerous thing that we had, and that was not that was not without purpose. I see that as a plan, very clear. Way before communism, because the French Revolution started already.
Sure.
Giving the new idea of a religion. Now we are the religion, the state. We are the religion, and believe in what I will tell you. And that's why they call it the Middle Ages a middle, right? Because now we have light. We are enlightened, so we know what you need for living, what you need for learning, and so on. So I just would like to discuss with you guys this kind of point of view, because Islamism is taking a place that the Christians gave up. I wouldn't say give up. There is a big hole in each heart of man in this civilization, this materialist civilization, and the Islamism is bringing something that Christianism nowadays is not giving to people. Like a spirituality, respect, rules, order, and that was on purpose. Let us take the true spirituality from these Christians, and let us make them like a cloud, And when they will talk about stupid things, now we will present another religion that will do what, like Diana said, we use aggressive power to take over.
Yeah. The concept of the enemy is related to Islam and the attack on Christianity, which our society has sustained. It's very interesting. Diana's book, Death of the Grown-Up, reminded me of a movie called Slackers. And what you just said just now, Alan, reminded me of a song by John Lennon called Imagine, I think it's called. Diana, am I right about that?
Right.
And the song is an attack on country, God and country, basically.
Yes, very much so.
Which has kind of a beautiful melody. And, of course, if you imagine there's no heaven, you imagine there's no God, you imagine there's no country. This is John Lennon's song, if people remember this song. And I remember when I was, I must have been 13 years old or 14 years old when I was hearing this song, driving to school in a car. I mean, I wasn't driving, I was being driven to school in a car. And it was on the car radio, and I remember thinking how beautiful the song was, and then I started thinking about the words, and then I started thinking, this song is not good.
Good for you, Dad. A young Jeff Nyquist.
I mean, it was. It's not, and of course, it's just what Diana was saying, and there's something in this idea of taking away our identity, taking away God and country, and bringing Muslims. There's something about bringing Muslims into America, into Western Europe, that is trying to break down country and God. Is there not? Is there not?
Into Brazil too, okay?
Into Brazil too.
Brazil too. Oh wow.
Yes. Well, it's bringing in a cohort, a block, a population block that can reliably be expected based on all experience, history, news, to colonize. These are colonizing peoples. They bring with them their way of life, which is according to Islamic law, which is completely antithetical to what we have in our countries. What we have cannot coexist with Islamic law. It becomes subjugated to Islamic law as Islamic populations grow bigger. Now, to affect change in a country, as we've seen in Europe, Europe is like a great big, huge petri dish for North and South America to look at, because you see very small populations becoming blocks in the cities and changing the laws, setting up parallel societies, setting up Sharia law courts, changing the food in the school system, changing the rhythms of the town according to the mosque services and the loudspeakers of the call to prayer, no longer having co-ed swimming hours. I mean, these things sound like small things, but by these very small everyday activities that change according to Islamic law across Europe, we've seen it, you see the Islamic orbit taking in the host country. And this becomes a matter of appeasement, it becomes a matter of accommodation, it's all manner of strategy to coexist, but at a certain point there is no coexistence, there is what is known as dhimitude, the condition of the non-Muslim living under Islamic law, living in subjugation to Islamic law, being subdued by it. And this is the pattern we've seen, and you would think that we could learn from this. But we don't learn from this, and so we see it accelerating in Europe, and we see plans to accelerate it here. It's an absolutely terrifying moment in existence.
And we're not being defended. I mean, nobody in power, respectable power, is saying we have to stop this now. If the people that are saying it are people who aren't really technically in charge, and it almost seems like, well, what is it that's impelling these elites to do this experiment? I mean, what is going on in their mind? I mean, how did they, and they're all like one block about it. It's like they're all like zombies moving in the same direction. I mean,
They are. I don't know if some of them are driven by this diversity model that does seem to drive some of them. Money drives a lot of it. You've got a huge business. The way it works in America, there are these quote religious charities that don't seem particularly religious, but they get huge contracts, huge, multi-million, 100 million, massive contracts from the government that you can actually look at on the government websites, and they get so much money per head. I mean, this does become a huge business. The bureaucracy grows up around it to essentially care for these peoples for a time. Then they're left to the localities, which end up being overwhelmed and very often in dire straits trying to accommodate these populations, whether it's in schooling, medical, housing, etc. It's a way of breaking up, though, the identity of the country, the cohesion of the country. We've seen this for years through the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which is a State Department office in America. There's a fantastic website I commend to anyone interested in how this is being done in America called Refugee Resettlement Watch. It's run by a lady named Ann Corcoran. She's a private citizen who became quite interested in this as she saw the government resettling refugees in her fairly rural Maryland area, and realized there was no real resource to understand what was being done, so she created it, and it's a very valuable tool. Certainly now we're seeing this ramped up. We're seeing the press of, I don't know what, guilt or what have you, to take, 200,000 Syrian refugees here in America, huge numbers, of course, in Europe. Many of them are not even Syrian, as we're discovering. I mean, more than half. It's become a free-for-all. And it's very difficult to pin the reason. If there is a guiding reason, it seems like there is certainly a grab bag of reasons. I think many people are motivated by several different things to affect this. I recently started watching a UN representative or UN official named Peter Sutherland, who I had not been familiar with before. He's on Twitter and elsewhere, but I started watching his statements about the absolute necessity for everyone to start taking refugees right away. Just the level of order and pressing of this concept on people is very strong. He certainly is one of the ideological architects of this. He's the UN official in charge of international migration. And when you start looking at that program, you do start seeing this as a grand plan. There's just absolutely no doubt that this is not being organized at the international level. Then you see the people on lower levels who seem to be genuinely concerned with humanitarian issues. But what does humanitarian mean when a country essentially extinguishes itself in the name of helping others? I mean, it's not humanitarian at a certain point. It's masochism. And so, you have to start peeling that back as well to understand that. Meanwhile, you still wonder, where do the people go when the governments do not protect them, when the governments have no interest in protecting them, in securing their future, the actual natives of the indigenous populations of these countries, if you will. Our Senator Sessions recently wrote a piece about telling with Representative David Bratt, telling the Republicans to curb immigration into the U.S. or quit. This was their ultimatum. It's a great ultimatum. No one's listening. But it was a very good piece where they're laying out the facts of even our legal immigration, which is absolutely overwhelming the nation at this point, needs to be halted, if not drastically curtailed at least, so that we can deal with it. But in the course of his article, they discuss the idea of the government needing to have compassion for Americans in their immigration schemes. And this is something that is absent in most Western governments. There is no compassion for Brazilians, for Americans, for Germans, for French. It's all about the other. Getting back to Jeff's original question, do we have enemies? Certainly we have enemies, or we have threats that are to our survival that need to be addressed as enemies in terms of warding them off. This is mass suicide. It is also murder, because many people in Europe do not want to die. They do not want their cultures to die. And so it's not just suicide. It is a murder that's going on, and it's you wonder what will happen tomorrow, where this is going. But certainly this is the extremis that we're looking at taking shape today.
Diana, sorry, Jeff.
Yeah, if you destroy my identity, in some sense, you are murdering me.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, so it's not just suicide, which people can sort of say, well, that's you're taking your own responsibility here. No, this is being done not in our name. No one's being consulted. The rules that they have carefully laid, I mean, the European Union is nothing if it is not a lot of regulations and rules. I mean, they're strangling numbers of treaties and rules about everything down to how to make a cheese. But in this case, they're basic rules about the formation of the union and the borderless or the free travel within the union has been completely junked. They don't want to protect their own laws that even make their existence possible. And when you have a nation state like Hungary actually seeking to enforce European Union laws of the external border with the rest of the world and the border internally, which is to register people and have people moving around in an orderly way, you have the center, Brussels, telling them not to do it. I mean, not to follow their own treaties. So you see the extent of this chaos, and that's when you start to question, well, what is this really about? What is really going on?
Yeah. Alan, you had something?
Yeah, just before the questions, I would like to tell the audience, you can make questions here below in Facebook, in Twitter, in YouTube, and we will read it for you. Before the questions come up, we have two here ready. I just would like to emphasize Aristotle used to say, our identity needs a group to live, right? We have this necessity. We cannot just be, we cannot build our identity without a group, like alone. I will find my identity alone, and we need a group. And we know very well that Western realized it as a group when they became Christian. That's the way we went out from Europe and went to South America, North America. We built our Christian civilization, and attacking again. Sorry that I'm going back to that point again, but if I'm wrong, correct me. But the only one way to destroy the true I wouldn't say collectivism, but the true idea of a group is attacking the Christianism, because the Christianism was the only one that could be able to give for each person their true identity. Without this idea, I'm not saying that without Christianism the person wouldn't be able to find himself or herself. I'm just saying that once our civilization was built through the Christianism, we cannot take over of these people if we will not destroy the Christianism. And they destroyed. For example, I am Catholic, Jeff is Christian, and we both need to face every Sunday, every day, our leaders. So they destroyed our leaders. And when you say that people in Europe don't want to lose their identity, but who they will look for? You know, it's like we used to watch or we used to listen to our priest or our pastor, and now who gonna we listen to? Because we have no identity anymore. There is no Western civilization without Christian civilization, and they attacked both. And that's why I do believe that we need to find a way to do a parallel magisterium, you know, not counting on with the leaders, not living not because of the leader, but in spite of the leaders, and going to the same direction that we know what is right to do. and building this parallel magisterium. You know, being a Christian, Catholic, not because of the church, but in spite of the church.
Well, I would say, Alan, that one of the problems is, and the problem that I had with the church that I am a member of, is that the leadership of the church seems to be against the church, seems to be against the principles and the beliefs and the traditions. And as Diana pointed out, a lot of these organizations that are sucked into helping refugees, we had Jim Simpson on, who wrote a book about it. They are religious organizations, or ostensibly they're connected with various churches and church groups. We are in a position where not only our political secular leaders are betraying their own countries and their own people, but the religious leaders are betraying their own parishioners, their own followers of their own religion. They're not upholding the principles. I mean, just look at the gay marriage thing, for example, and how many churches are buckling on these different issues. They're not really fighting it. You know, it takes some lone person somewhere to give up their job, you know, to face some kind of state sanction because they're in an official position and they won't go along with gay marriage. Or the couple in Oregon, or the business in Oregon. Diana, you mentioned it the other day. Tell us about that. The bakers. Yeah, tell us about that. It's kind of horrific. It's an example.
It's horrific. It was something I read just this week about a case that had been going on for a time. A mom and pop bakery did not want to bake a wedding cake for a lesbian wedding, and they've been taken to court, sued, and the judgment against them was something like $135,000, which is an awful lot of money. And I just was reading that very recently the state of Oregon is making moves to seize assets to pay this fine that was levied against them. So you have the state moving in this anti-religious, anti-freedom manner on this really hot button issue in the States right now. It is horrifying, and it does show the extent to which the church at this point seems to need to go underground in a sense. I mean, there's a sense in which these beliefs are not considered legal anymore, and that's another betrayal, another whack at identity, another manifestation of state power. And I think it all goes back to, you know, Jeff's original notion about how do we recognize, or do we have enemies, friends. It goes back to the undermining of morality itself, which is at the basis of Christianity, also Judaism. I'm Jewish. I go back to the Ten Commandments and see Western civilization arising from monogamy, which arose 5,000 years ago. You see, again, this notion of definition, defining marriage between a man and a woman, eliminating polygamy, subjugating or subliminating sexuality from the society at large, making it into a more significant relationship between one man, one woman. You can see the rise of family, of privacy, of private property, of family lines. I mean, you can really see how this is probably the singular building block of what we look at as Western civilization. A definition, a self-definition that, again, is being unwrapped, just destroyed, made meaningless. Now marriage has no definition. It I'm sure will continue to expand. I'm sure we're seeing the normalization of polygamy, which of course is another feature of non-Western life that Islam brings into our countries. Recently, one of the members, I believe, of House of Lords was talking in England about the average Muslim man in England is father to 20 children with 4 wives. I know that the English tax system has been recognizing polygamous relationships in tax purposes, in tax forms, even if they have not recognized them completely. You do see, again, Sharia courts being normalized. You see Sharia courts, Sharia law being integrated officially into British law. So maybe the polygamous relationships have been as well, but certainly it's a de facto kind of recognition we're already seeing. So again, this notion of you can't define your enemy if you can't define yourself, and clearly we are not supposed to be defining ourselves, and clearly the state has replaced religious order in life, religious morality in life. These are again, trends and movements and incursions that we can track back at least 100 years, but certainly longer, but in real, very strong means over the past century. And now we're really seeing them bearing fruit, coming to the point where a bakery is being penalized, where people are left bereft of protection, of the basic protection of the state, which would come to the border. Again, the basic definition, almost like marriage in private life, the boundary of your country in public life would be the very basic definitions, limitations that you want imposed in order to define you, in order to identify who you are, where your place in society, in the world is. Without that, it really is chaos, and that is why I think the threat to individual liberty, self-government, is so profound, because once there is chaos, the only means of existing in chaos, in violence, in lawlessness, is with a superstate providing mass surveillance, mass security, mass invasion of your privacy, of everything, in order to preserve life. It no longer becomes a self-monitoring or self-legislating kind of system. Lawlessness becomes the norm, and you have to have the overbearing security state in order to live. And that is what I actually see evolving, certainly in Europe, also in America. I mean, I certainly feel it. If we compared what it's like today to go through public buildings to earlier, what it's like to fly our airplanes and so on, we all know what we're talking about. And the transparency and invasiveness, twin sides, I guess, of the internet, of all of the means of communication now. These are the tools of the superstate, and this is definitely where we're evolving. And the nation state and self-definition are still stumbling blocks, even if they are now maybe outliers, or at least at this point, outliers.
Yeah.
Let's go to the questions, Jeff.
Yeah, sure. Let's do the questions. Some of our listeners have questions, so let's go to that.
Yes. The first one is, thanks Jeff and Alan for the show. I live in Germany. I would like to understand why Mrs. Merkel decided to open German borders to the Muslim world. Diana has an answer to Vanna Coleman from Germany.
Well, it's interesting that a German citizen is looking for answers that, and I am too, and I mean, it's tragic that the government has not, Merkel's government has not been able to explain this, and I think it's because there is no rational explanation. I don't pretend to know the answer, but I have been looking at the rhetoric of Angela Merkel and many of the other people who are involved in this diversity project. Certainly, she is interested in labor. I mean, this is the economic argument you see bandied about. They need more labor in Germany. I personally don't really buy this. I don't know why countries need to continue expanding. I don't know why it's bad if a country's population shrinks from time to time. I mean, we've seen this is presented always as catastrophe, and
Hello, Jeff.
Yeah, I don't know. I think
Diana.
I think we lost Diana's connection here for a second.
Yeah. Why does she come back?
Yeah, she'll realize she's disconnected in a second.
I would like to read the second question.
Oh, here.
Okay, yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, I don't know what happened. My computer blanked. Someone didn't like my answer, I guess. But what I was just saying was there is an economic argument made, and I was also making the point I don't really see why it's necessarily a bad thing if your country isn't constantly growing in population. But there is also a humanitarian argument that is made that we need to be compassionate and help refugees, certainly what defines a refugee becomes a big question when you realize, I think the numbers lately have been reflecting something like 1 in 5 could be even possibly considered a refugee from persecution at this point. But I think something else is going on, because I saw Angela Merkel's rhetoric about this when she was lecturing, really, to a metalworkers union recently in Germany, and I wrote about this at my website, dianawest.net. She was telling them that this inverse globalization, we might say, this massive incursion of people, is actually the necessary logical fallout of globalization. That Germany has prospered in this period of globalization, and it's only to be expected that because of Germany products and so on going out to the world, that people would come in. And we Germans must learn to deal with it, we must accommodate it, we must change ourselves so that we can make this integration work. Words to that effect. And this struck me as very familiar to something that I had heard earlier in the year, which was Angela Davis, the communist revolutionary back from the 60s and 70s in America. She was in Berlin this year, 2015, in May, and she was talking to immigrants, African immigrants in Berlin, and they were expressing their grievances to her. The Berlin government had not given them housing and jobs and adequate medical care, and boo-hoo-hoo. And she was talking back to them about what the whole thing meant. And she talked about the struggle, which is always a good Marxist rallying word, and how the migrant movement, I think she called it the refugee movement, is the movement of the 21st century, something she said. It is the challenge, the refugee movement is the challenge to global capitalization or capitalism. That to me rang a bell with what Angela Merkel was talking about in terms of the West essentially having it coming to them, I think is implicit in both their statements. They're both talking about something that is a natural reaction. They're both talking about globalization, capitalism being now redressed by this movement. And when you add that, you layer that onto the discussions at the EU level of the highest officials, the highest unelected, completely non-responsible to any voters, officials, the commissioners, they are talking in these same kinds of terms, talking about the, one of them recently, Frans Timmermans, a democratic socialist from Netherlands, and an EU official was talking about how diversity is human destiny, we have to accommodate this incursion, or he doesn't use that word, but this inflow of Islam into the EU. You hear it from activists. There's a German woman named Annette Kahan who is said to be, reported to be, Angela Merkel's Facebook censor. There was talk of Germany, and I think this is actually happening, censoring, pressuring people not to express themselves about the immigrants online on social media. And this woman, Annette Kahan, was in an interview last year, and she was discussing how no more, we must re-educate ourselves to understand that no more can there be a place where it is just Swedish people or just Portuguese people or just white people. That diversity must be the multicultural, I think she said these are all now multicultural places in the world. Everything must be a multicultural place in the world. So you start seeing there is a cadre of officials, and I would include this man at the UN, the in charge of international migration, man Peter Sutherland, the person I mentioned earlier, very high-level global officials, people with massive influence, who are seeking to enforce diversity as an ideological dictate. And I think that that has to be what is underlying much of this official government power bosses, lackadaisical, that's a terrible word, but this feckless failure to address the failure on the absence of borders, this overwhelming chaos that they're bringing into their countries. There is a cadre of people who see this as I believe, as the next stage of human development. These are the utopians, the radical ideologists who are essentially promoting this and certainly seeking to enforce this on native populations.
Well, I can recognize the theme of our last guest in what you just said. His theme was about Marxist dialectics, and you talk about Muslim here, Christendom here, thesis and antithesis, and now we're going to create a new synthesis.
Yeah.
And it's really very dialectical what they're doing, and it's consciously so. It seems like the way you just described it, just laid it out, kind of like, and you know, there's this thing in Marx where globalization, which was an idea back when Marx was writing, you know, because capitalism and colonialism were bringing all the countries of the world together under just a handful of empires, that the idea was that this was going to be a vehicle for this new form of collectivism, socialism, communism.
Right. Sure.
And now this is now bringing Islam into Christendom, destroys Christendom, and perhaps, I guess, neutralizes Islam, and paves the way for a kind of international human being, a human Soviet animal.
Soviet man. Now, I would say that what we have seen in the last decade certainly take place in Europe across these parliamentary democracies. We have seen blocs, actually also somewhat in the United States as well. We've seen political forces come together, red-green alliances they're called, red meaning the left and green meaning Islam, red-green alliances coming together to block the patriotic parties, the anti-immigration parties, the anti-Islamization parties, the anti-EU parties. I mean, these are the Eurosceptic parties, to block them from achieving parliamentary coalitions, governing coalitions. We certainly saw this. I was watching very closely about 10 years ago in Belgium, where we saw this very much with the Vlaams Belang party being shut out by a cordon sanitaire by the left parties, which would include, you know, some Muslim politicians as well. We see this certainly in the case of Netherlands, where Geert Wilders' Party for Freedom is shut out, even though it's the largest party at this point. Next time elections come by, if we see his numbers go up, we would see similar tactics. We see this in Sweden, where they actually, when Sweden Democrats, which is the patriotic anti-immigration party, anti-EU party, when they began polling, going from microscopic percentages just a few years ago to being the leading, if not number 2, or the leading party as far back as last December, we actually saw the parliament come together, the other parties come together to rewrite their own rules to prohibit, to legislate against the normal tradition of an election, which had been triggered by these polls. They actually wrote out democracy in order to prevent a parliamentary election that would return Sweden Democrats in any level of strength into the parliament. Denmark is a little different. Danish People's Party, which is the kindred party there, has managed to rule in, or at least be part of, rather, center-right coalitions. And in fact, they were instrumental in a recent stroke of brilliance to slash asylum benefits, social welfare for asylum seekers in Denmark about a month ago, which drastically reduced the press of this incursion of peoples on Denmark. All of a sudden, Denmark was no longer a happy destination, and you saw all manner of techniques not to find themselves in Denmark having to claim asylum there because of their rules. Where you claim asylum, you're supposed to be processed. If there weren't going to be goodies there, you saw people figuring out ways to bypass Denmark and get to Sweden or Germany, depending on what they could do. So you see, first of all, you see these measures work, but you know, you also see how this Red-Green Alliance already is effective in shutting out the patriots, the nation-state people.
It's interesting. Yeah, Alan, we have another question from a guest.
I heard some echo. Do you?
No, I didn't hear it. But it was the question was, Diana, what percentage of the population does it take of becoming Muslim before the Muslims can take over the country? Is there some kind of rule of thumb here?
I think there is. I think in terms of take over the country, that would be, I mean, in other words, have a Muslim majority in a parliament or a Congress. I don't know what number. I mean, that would probably be a very large number. However, in terms of seizing the levers of power, in terms of introducing Sharia norms, it's shockingly small. You started seeing Great Britain, United Kingdom rather, going Islamic in terms of Sharia courts and all manner of normalizing Islam within the country with a population that was under 2%. I mean, it's really shocking. I kept looking, when I was covering this in the last decade, I remember watching this because I think the United Kingdom is one of the leading Islamized countries of Europe. It was happening, it was really out in front from an early time. And you'd look at the populations, the demographic, tiny. Now you go to a country like France, and you're much high. There are many more percentages. What is it, 9% or admitted to be something like that? Mm-hmm. Again, it's not. You would think it's a very small minority, but they tend to congregate in cities. They tend to vote as blocks, and they make very strident demands. And because when you see the peaceable Muslims, the Muslims who are using the system to advance Sharia, they are working hand in glove with the terrorist aspects of Islam who are also seeking to advance Sharia. So because they have the same purpose, the terror aspect becomes a point of blackmail. You saw this, if you remember, about 10 years ago. You saw this with the airplane plot, which happened when it was interrupted. But you saw this when there was a plot to blow up airplanes coming out of Britain about 2006. And even though the plot was interrupted, the Muslim organizations, supposedly the peaceful people in these organizations, immediately went to the government after this plot was interrupted with a list of demands to further Islamize British life. It was uncanny, and you actually started to see how this actually works hand in glove. The threat of violence is followed by the demand for accommodation or appeasement. So even though these populations, again, this was 2%, 3% max, you see this incredible manifestation of power. They're excellent, very talented at this, and you see this across the board. It's surprising, and that's why it's so critical to halt Islamic immigration, because such tiny percentages are going to become Sharia demographics. And that's just what a country needs to really sit down and discuss, which, again, we've been discouraged, if not, that's much too weak a word. We've been repressed in having these discussions since 9/11, particularly when it became so important. In America, we do not have these discussions, these debates do not enter the political arena at all, ever. In other words, do we ever say, well, if we bring in 200,000 Syrians, some large number of them will be Sharia proponents or Sharia adherents. What does that mean to a polity that will be taking 5,000, 10,000 of them, 600, 700 of them? What will it mean? Do we want to see a Sharia demographic form whereby our liberties are democratically eliminated? And I think that it becomes, to the questioner's question, that becomes the question. At what point are they democratically eliminated? Well, that's a very high number when they're gone forever. However, freedom of speech does not exist anymore in countries with even this very tiny Islamic demographic.
The democracy will be the democracy, right? Will be the next weapon against us.
Right. Right.
And once you get rid of freedom of speech, you can now limit speech. There's no basic point of stopping where you limit speech.
Right, which we do not have freedom of speech. And all you have to do is go back to the Danish cartoon crisis started in 2005 with the Muhammad drawings in the very tiny newspaper in Denmark, Jyllands-Posten, and 5 media outlets in America published them. Maybe, I would say no more than 5, none of the mainstream, none of the biggies. This was an abdication of speech, an absolute capitulation that we've not recovered from. It was surreal to live through because, I'm sorry, that's my dog. See on the film now, Freddie, no. I'm going to take him out.
Diana.
Yes.
Olavo de Carvalho, because we are about to finish, and I would like to mention that he unfortunately couldn't be with us today, but in his last article in Brazil, Olavo de Carvalho says something really amazing. If the government promote and want to make a new structure of a population, like if the government promotes something, it's against the democracy right now. I mean, the majority of people, the government is saying, I am against all of you who is alive.
Who what?
Who is alive?
Oh, yeah, okay.
Because if I'm against the democracy right now, for example, now here in Brazil, during this week, for the first time after many years and decades, we got the Congress approving the law that will give us the freedom to have our guns, our weapons, for the first time after decades. And now that was approved in the Congress. Now we'll go to the Senate for the senators, and that will go back to the Congress and should be valid. We are still in progress in this fight, but there is one thing. It's amazing. The majority of people want this freedom to have their own guns, and many politicians and the government, of course, because our government is totally communist, is fighting against the people. But the way Olavo de Carvalho pictured that, I really love it, because once government is fighting against people who are alive, they want to create a new nation, you know. The government is saying, I am against all of you who is alive, you know. It's such a thing that comes into what you said. I think your dogs agree with me.
This dog.
Freddie, come here.
So Jeff, we are at the end of our show. Would like to thank you so much to be with me here, helping me here today again. But mainly Diana, thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.
Join us in this talk show, and it's always a pleasure to have you here.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and Freddie as well. And I think he wanted to contribute something. I'll have to interpret it and tell you what it is.
I noticed he got in front of the camera to make his statement.
Yes, he did.
Yeah.
So he knows about the cameras and such as that.
Well, he's a poodle.
Okay.
Really,
thank you very much for joining us for another episode.
Thank you, Diana. Thank you.
Oh, I enjoyed it. Thank you.
I would like to ask you to like this video and share this on your Facebook, Twitter, Google Plus, whatever, to make this talk known for the people who still don't believe we are enemies. And I think the main thing that we say here, we need to know our own identity to start fighting against our enemies. I think this is a nice statement that Diana made here. And I'll see you next week. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye now.
you. Bye-bye.